Good morning and welcome to today's administrative meeting of the Public Service Commission. Before we get started, we just have one staff announcement today. Me gustaría felicitar a Laquelli Green, su promoción. Laquelli Green in our Consumer Affairs Division is one of our only Spanish speakers here at the agency, and she has been promoted in her position as an administrative specialist in the Office of Consumer Affairs. So congratulations, Laquelli. Thanks for all the work you do. And with that, we have a full docket this afternoon, but why don't we begin by approving the minutes from last week's meeting on March 27th, 2019. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the minutes from the March 27th administrative meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved. Madam Secretary, the consent agenda.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There are 4 items on the consent agenda. The first item is Extenet Asset Entity LLC, filed on January 24, 2019, application for authority to provide facility-based local exchange telecommunications and services in Maryland. Item 2 is Extenet Asset Entity LLC, Extenet Systems, Inc., filed on January 25, 2019, joint application to transfer certain assets and participate in certain financing transactions. Item 3 is SureTech Insurance Company, filed on February 19, 2019, notification of the cancellation of the surety bond of ARA Consulting Group, LLC, DBA Commercial Power. And item 4 is Sunsea Energy, LLC, filed on October 9, 2018, an application for a license to supply natural gas or natural gas supply services in Maryland.
Thank you. Do commissioners have questions on the consent items? Seeing none, is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. For item number 1, I move that we grant the requested authorization conditioned on the completion of the corporate transaction, which is in mail log number 223749. Grant the company the requested COMAR waivers and waivers for local exchange service providers, and direct the company to file a clean copy of its tariff with an effective date of April 3rd, 2019. For item number 2, I move that we note the filing and the participation of Extenet Asset Entity LLC in the financing transactions described in the joint application. For item number 3, I move that we note the filing. And for item number 4, I move that we grant the company a license to operate as a natural gas supplier in Maryland for the customer classes and service territories applied for and recommended by staff, and direct the company to file notice with the Commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in the application.
Thank you, Commissioner Linton. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motions are approved. Madam Secretary, the administrative agenda.
Item 5 on the administrative agenda is Western Surety Company, filed on January 3, 2019, notification of cancellation of the surety bond of U.S. Sun Energy, Inc.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Lloyd Spivak for the Commission staff. This is Western Surety Company's notice to the Commission that it has canceled the surety bond of U.S. Sun Energy Incorporated on December 29, 2018. U.S. Sun is a licensed electricity broker in Maryland. It was granted a license to operate as an electricity supplier in Maryland via Commission letter order dated October 20, 2010. As described in staff's comments, staff has made several attempts to contact U.S. Sun and has received no response. The State Department of Assessments and Taxation lists the status of U.S. Sun as forfeited, meaning the right of the entity to conduct business in Maryland has been relinquished, and the company has no right to use its name. There are no open complaints against U.S. Sun, and the company owes $100 in assessments. Staff recommends that the Commission revoke the company's license to supply electricity services in Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Spivak. Do we know if U.S. Sun has any current customers in the state of Maryland?
We do not know for sure, but I would note that they are a broker, so they're not actually providing ongoing services to customers, generally speaking, or would not actually be providing ongoing services to customers. Beyond that, generally the source of information for the number of customers would be the company itself, and since we haven't been able to contact them, we would not be able to get that information from them.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move we revoke the company's license to supply electricity services in Maryland.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Item number 6 is the Potomac Edison Company, filed on February 27, 2019. Request for a waiver of CPCN requirement to run a short loop line from the existing Dobbs Monocacy 230 kV transmission line to a new 34.5 kV sub-transmission substation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. James Greger on behalf of staff. Item 6 on the agenda concerns a request from the Potomac Edison Company for a certificate of public convenience and necessity waiver pursuant to Public Utilities Article Section 7-207B4. PUA Section 7-207 requires an electric company to obtain a CPCN prior to commencing construction of an overhead transmission line that is designed to carry a voltage in excess of 69,000 volts. However, exceptions are outlined within the article. PUA Section 7-207B4I states that the Commission shall waive the CPCN requirement should it find that construction, 1, does not require the company to obtain new property or rights-of-way through eminent domain, nor 2, require larger or higher structures to accommodate increased voltage or larger conductors. On February 27, 2019, PE filed a request to the Commission for a waiver from the requirement to obtain a CPCN. The request includes permission to build a 230 kilovolt transmission loop line to intercept and connect the existing Dobbs Monocacy line to a new proposed 34.5 kilovolt subtransmission substation to be named West Jefferson. This project would involve the installation of 2 115-foot-long new inline steel pole structures, 2 aluminum conductor steel reinforced cables, and 2 shield wires to be placed in between 2 existing towers. The company asserts that this project would enhance the reliability of PE's distribution system. In the last 5 years, the company has experienced 12 source outages to the Brunswick and Jefferson substations, negatively affecting the company's reliability metrics. The addition of the West Jefferson substation as an additional source for the circuit will mitigate source outages and enhance service reliability to approximately 4,300 customers. The company has initiated community outreach and notification in Frederick County, where the project is to take place, including presenting the project to the public in Brunswick, Maryland, and has meetings scheduled with Frederick County officials. In its filing, the company asserts that this project would not require PE to obtain new property or rights-of-way and does not require larger or higher structures to accommodate increased voltage or larger conductors. Staff concludes that the statutory requirement under PUA 7-207B4I for obtaining a waiver has been satisfied. Staff further notes that the need for the project is prompted by reliability concerns associated with Brunswick and Jefferson substations that are currently served radially from the Lime Kiln substation or Millville substation. It is expected that the construction of the proposed loop and West Jefferson substation would improve the redundancy and reliability of the company's distribution system. As such, staff recommends that the Commission grant the company's request for a waiver of the CPCN requirement under PUA Section 7-207B4I to permit the company to build the transmission loop line from the existing Dobbs Monocacy line to the new West Jefferson substation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greger, and for your team as well for putting together the buck sheet and the presentation. Counsel for Potomac Edison. Mr. Trout, we got you a podium.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, Commissioners, my name is Jeffrey Trout. As you know, I'm counsel to the Potomac Edison Company. The company concurs with the staff's recommendation, and we are here to answer your questions.
Mr. Trout, I was taking a look at the cost estimates. Not too long ago, the rule of thumb was about $1 million a mile of overhead transmission line. That number has obviously gone up across the industry. Here we're talking about a section that's 115 feet long. Is that right?
Maybe 115-foot long.
Two-
sections, but
two-
yes, the-
okay.
It's about 200 feet long.
Taking a look at the two documents that were filed by Potomac Edison on March 21st and February 27th. On February 27th, Potomac Edison stated that it would cost approximately $1 million for the project. March 21st, the estimate cited was $790,000. Can you explain the discrepancy between the two?
Yes, it's rounding, Mr. Chairman. In the initial document, we rounded the 790 or 800,000 up to $1 million, and in response to the data requests, we gave a more precise number.
Okay. So the more accurate figure is $790,000.
That would be the more accurate figure, recognizing that all the figures are pre-construction estimates.
Rounded to the next million.
I tend to err on the side of rounding off construction estimates because precision can be misleading.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions? Mr. Greger, is that right? The length of the line is about 200 feet? Is that?
Engineering.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Samrawit Darare. I'm a staff engineer with the Commission. That was the number provided in the filing.
Okay. I don't know where I saw 115, but I kept writing that down for some reason.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, that was the height of the projected structures.
I'm reading something to the fact that it's going to be extending for approximately 115 feet across land owned by Potomac Edison. Oh, and the structures are also 115 feet tall. All right, well, regardless, all right. Thank you. Oh, Commissioner Herman.
Mr. Greger, just to clarify, this is one of the mandatory waivers, is it not? Because it's on existing right-of-way and it's not taller and to carry larger conductors. Is that correct?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you.
With that, is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. For item number 6, I move we grant the company's request for a waiver of the CPCN requirement under PUA 7-207B4I to permit the company to build the transmission loop line from the existing Dubs Monocacy line to the new West Jefferson substation.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Thank you.
Item number 7, and the last item on the agenda, is Baltimore Gas and Electric Company filed on January 11, 2019, request for a waiver of CPCN requirement for a project to modify an existing overhead transmission line to improve reliability performance.
Good morning, Mr. Wilson. If you could have a seat at the table, I have a feeling that we'll be on this case for a while.
Okay.
As well as counsel for the utility. Do we have a representative from PPRP? Thank you. Office of People's Counsel. Good morning, Mr. Alexander.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning,
We
Commissioner.
have the director of PPRP with us today. I think we'll have a seat, Mr. Director, if you'd like to have a seat next to your counsel. Are there any other parties that I neglected to recognize that wish to speak on this item? Okay. I see we have other BG&E representatives. We could also use the podium behind Mr. Herson if necessary. Thank you. All right, Mr. Wilson, take it from the top.
Okay. Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Peter Wilson on behalf of staff. This is a waiver request of a CPCN requirement, a little different than the last one we had, but it includes some of the same laws, which I won't repeat from the prior presentation. and jump right into the meat of the matter. BGE proposes to replace two existing transmission lines running 1.8 miles from the Pennsylvania border in Harford County to the BGE Five Forks substation. The plan calls for the replacement of a total of 40 latticework structures carrying the parallel lines with 12 monopoles accommodating both lines within the same right-of-way. The project does not qualify for the mandatory waiver like the one the Commission just granted to PE. Pursuant to PUA Section 7207B4 small I, because the new poles will be substantially higher than the structures they replace, and because the size of the new transmission conductors will increase. BG seeks grant of a discretionary waiver of the CPCN requirement pursuant to PUA Section 7207B3 2 small I, which permits the Commission to grant a discretionary waiver for good cause. In addition to meeting with BGE and PPRP, staff has reviewed documents submitted by BGE and BGE's responses to staff's data requests, and recommends that BGE's request for discretionary waiver be denied. The project proposed here is substantially different than the circumstances in the two prior instances in which the Commission granted BGE a discretionary waiver at an administrative meeting. In the first case, which was in 2017, BGE applied for a mandatory waiver asserting replacement poles were no taller than the existing structure. Staff determined otherwise, but determined the slight variance supported a discretionary waiver. The second case, which was a 2018 case, was a replacement line within the brownfields of the industrial park on the former Best Steel plant property and did not impact the environment or neighboring properties. In each of these two cases, staff concluded that the proposed work could be performed in a manner such that additional CPCN proceedings would not provide additional protections. Most significantly, PPRP did not oppose those waivers. Staff relies on PPRP to give its opinion concerning the environment and related subject matter areas of the 7 state agencies it represents, and to propose conditions for any proposed work. PPRP has expressed that it needs a full CPCN review in order that it can formulate conditions to ensure protection of the environment. Additionally, this project does involve residential neighbors who will be denied the meaningful public input and comment afforded by public hearings and a written comment period. Staff therefore recommends that the Commission deny the requested waiver of the requirement to obtain a CPCN.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Office of People's Counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. Gary L. Alexander for the Office of People's Counsel. As I know the Commission is aware, we did file comments in a timely manner on April 1. I know that everybody has read them, and I don't think there's a need to repeat most of anything. Some of it's repeated from the application and from staff and from PPRP. All I'd like to do is briefly emphasize that the proposed towers will be about 40 feet higher than the existing tallest tower. It at least calls into question BGE's claim in its request for waiver that the reduction in the number of structures means that the project will result in reduced environmental and other impacts. Now, reducing the number of required transmission towers by increasing span lengths increases the visibility of the proposed new line to residents located further away from the circuits. But there's something more. It's that while it's likely not possible to rebuild these lines without at least some increases in height, They could be minimized by increasing the number of transmission towers needed for the proposed lines, thereby reducing span lengths. And to estimate the degree of minimization possible would require further investigation by, for example, if necessary, by PPRP's experts, by staff's in-house expert, and perhaps no decision has been made, but we would, OPC would retain an outside consultant, which has not been decided yet, but would have to be someone with expertise to look at this more closely and make that decision. And finally, the new transmission lines will use larger conductors than the ones being replaced, and it's believed to reflect improvements in conductor technology over the 100 years since the lines were originally built. But these larger conductor sizes do not affect the height of the tower heights, which are typically driven by voltage-driven clearance requirements. And just as a broad general statement about this is, it's not a tiny project. It's a significant project of which has a significant cost. It has a significant change in the visibility environment, and the main thing is that one of the things that could be done, as I understand it, and as the Commission knows, I'm not an expert, so I don't claim that expertise, but it's my understanding that, again, if something were added, whether it's an extra tower or two, or as I said before, well, actually that's it. If you increase somewhat the number of towers, the height of the towers decreases. And so, we, in our letter, in our comments, we commended BGE for the outreach that it stated in its second filing in this case, but we just don't believe that in a case of this, in a project of this magnitude, a significant magnitude, that replaces the requirements of the CPCN, the formal requirements to formally hold public hearings, to formally provide notice, to consult with the governing body of the counties or municipal corporations. And these are formal requirements. Once in every 4 successive weeks immediately before the hearing date, there needs to be provided weekly notice of the public hearing and an opportunity for public comment, advertising in newspapers, 2 types of social media on the Commission's website, and it does mandate, and I'm talking about 7207, parentheses small d in parentheses 3 in parentheses small I in parentheses, that before the public hearing, the Commission must coordinate with the governing body of the county in which any portion of the construction of the overhead transmission line is proposed to be located, to identify additional options for providing in an efficient and cost-effective manner notice of the public hearing through other types of media that are familiar to the residents of the county or municipal corporation. Now, the last thing, it's the last thing in our comments, and it is sort of as we would, if this were, well, it would be the same thing. It's based on information and belief. I am not representing that this is definitely accurate, and I'm sure BGE can speak to it, but it's our understanding that there are other parts of this line that are similarly old and will need replacement or remedies of some sort to provide increased reliability. And those head down towards Baltimore. So the OPC doesn't believe that this should be considered in isolation of the other ones. Now, that doesn't mean that, in our view, that BGE should request a formal CPCN process for the whole line all at once, but we believe that in this CPCN proceeding, if the Commission does direct that it's a CPCN proceeding, that at least BGE provide a broader overview to the Commission of what is going to be continued to be needed until the fuller scope of the project is identified, so that the Commission can make a better decision on issuing on granting a request for a CPCN should the Commission decide to send this to deny BGE's request here and send it to a CPCN proceeding. And the very last thing I want to emphasize is that this rejection of BGE does not mean in any way to OPC that some project, some remedy needs to be done. These are 100-year-old poles, etc. We understand that. So the question is really, should a project of this large magnitude in dollars be considered through the CPCN process or wait? It's not an opinion on the validity of the project itself. But in the CPCN process, the Commission is directed to consider alternatives. And those alternatives can be provided by BGE, or they can be provided by the other parties sitting at this table. And that may give a better, it may allow the Commission to better review this project so that all of these things are considered. I went a little longer than I'd like to, and I thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Counsel for Power Plant Research Program.
Good morning, Commissioners. Sandra McLemore, Assistant Attorney General representing the Power Plant Research Program. I would like to thank you for allowing us to provide comments today. With me today is David Tansbell, Director of PPRP, who would like to provide the comments and also to answer any questions you may have on our late filing late last night. First of all, I would like to apologize for the late filing. However, unfortunately, we were unable to file it when we had anticipated, given the requisite approvals and input we needed before we could file. In a CPCN application, where there is a set procedure, PPRP has developed a smooth process to coordinate with this reviewing state agencies and get their input and their approvals. However, given that this is a relative novelty of a discretionary waiver, we have not yet perfected the process and modify it to set this instance, particularly where we have significant concerns, such as in this case. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Tansbell to provide comments, but I'm available for any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Director.
Chairman, Commissioners, again, my name is David Tansbell, the Director of the Power Plant Research Program. And again, I'd like to reiterate apologies for the late filing. Our process of review is set up for, larger scale review, in-depth analysis, and then that coordination with 7 state agencies. I think we have a good process down now. This is really the first time we've really gone through the full process of this shorter review, but that approval process through 6 state agencies and understanding where the authority and approval should be for a waiver, it was something that took some time to work out. So I apologize. We have reviewed BGE's request, and after a full review, the state is recommending that the request be denied. And I'll briefly go through a few reasons why we think it should be denied. First, there's no existing CPCN for this part of the line. This line is over 100 years old, so it has never gone through that process. Over the years, we have done a lot of research and developed a lot of best practices for operations and maintenance in right-of-ways. And those conditions are usually recommended to the commission to place on those right-of-ways. If this section does not go through the CPCN process, it's going to be decades before it will ever be placed under a CPCN. There's potential impacts to natural resources. This project involves the removal of over 40 towers, the installation of 12 new towers over a 1.8 mile span, requiring 8 access points and an area of disturbance of over 13 acres. This is not a small project. The Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife and Heritage Services has identified rare, threatened, and endangered species in the vicinity. If this project is allowed to go through the CPCN process, the state is most likely going to recommend extra conditions be placed in the area to ensure the security of that rare, threatened, and endangered species. Reliability and timing. While PPRP does understand that this project is part of a upgrade to increase reliability, we do not see the need for that there is any timing need to not go through the CPCN process. This is a section north of this section in Pennsylvania is part of that reliability upgrade, and we have no indication of when that upgrade will happen. So we feel there's only going to be minor reliability improvements if this project goes forward without the full project being completed. And lastly, public engagement. And as Office of People Counsel said, we do commend BGE for the outreach they've done. They have done a lot, but PPRP feels that the public engagement and public comment is one of the most vital parts of the CPCN process. And it is, we attending the public hearings is an eye-opening experience for us, and that the neighbors really do want to get out and have their voice heard and get on the record. And this waiver would remove their ability for the commission to hear, the concerns of the neighbors in the local community and the local government, and be able to respond to those concerns. It's for those reasons that the state is recommending that the waiver be denied.
Thank you. Counsel for Baltimore Gas and Electric.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Daniel Hurston for Baltimore Gas and Electric. I have with me, right behind me, Todd Chambers. He's the project manager for this particular project, and Chanel Rhodes-Reed, who's from our External Affairs Office. She was in charge of communication and outreach for this particular project. We also have a few other folks. I won't mention them by name unless they need to come to the podium, but we have folks who are well-versed in the environmental conditions associated with this project, the transmission engineering itself, the business aspect of it. So if you have questions, I hope we have the right people here to answer them this morning. As the other parties have stated, BG is seeking a waiver of the CPCN requirement under Public Utilities Article Section 7207B3, Romanet 2. This is the discretionary waiver provision of the code. This permits the Public Service Commission to grant a waiver for, quote, good cause to the CPCN requirement. I'd like to begin my remarks today by saying that, BGE completely understands and appreciates the seriousness of the CPCN process and the fact that the PSC takes this process very seriously. And when they have cases like this where there's an opportunity to grant a waiver, especially a discretionary waiver, we totally appreciate and understand that the Commission needs to scrutinize these projects very carefully in order to make a full and informed decision on whether to grant the waiver. So to that effort, we actually prepared a small presentation that I'd like to bring up on the screen now to give some more details about this project. I also have provided hard copies for your file. So here's an aerial photo of this particular project. As staff mentioned, this is a 1.8 mile project beginning at the Five Forks substation, and this is in Harford County, by the way, and traversing approximately 1.8 miles north to the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. Those numbers that you see there represent the approximate locations of the new monopole structures. There will be 12 structures erected as part of this project. BGE plans to...
Excuse me, did you bring copies for council?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Just pass these down. So BGE plans to replace 1.8 miles of what's called parallel single-circuit 115 kV transmission lines with a double-circuit monopole line between the substation and the Maryland PA line to increase reliability. The new tower line will be located between the existing parallel lines, effectively replacing 40 steel lattice towers with 12 weathering steel monopoles. Only one circuit will be installed on the new tower line. There will be an opportunity in the future for future expansion to add a second circuit if necessary. As I'll discuss in more detail in a minute, the foundation footprints associated with this transmission line will decrease significantly with this project. However, the operating voltages will not change. It's going to remain at 115 kV, and BGE does not need to obtain any additional real property rights, either by fee, agreement, or eminent domain. So why are we doing this project? This short line has had 7 outages in the past 10 years, which is a rate that is significantly above PJM's guidance target rate. In terms of the outages that we've been able to record, 2 were related to birds, 2 were related to conductor or hardware failures, 1 was related to a balloon interfering with the line, and 2 were unknown, although we think that they were likely to be avian events. When you have these aging splices, it has a tendency to drop the conductors from time to time. Given the minimal clearance that exists right now with the existing transmission lines, it's very likely that birds can interfere. What happens is they end up touching one of the phase conductors, and then another part of the bird touches the ground component of it, and they're essentially electrocuted in the line. Balloons, and I'm talking about the Mylar balloons here, not a hot air balloon. Mylar balloons have added exposure due to the parallel tower line operation right now. Basically, right now, there's 6 conductors, and under the new line, it would go down to 3, so there's less opportunity for interference with balloons and birds. And it's an aging infrastructure. It's over 100 years old at this point, and obviously, with that age, you have reliability issues and concerns. So the expected outcome here, if we're able to do this project, we'll have a significant increase in reliability because we'll have a significant reduction in the risk of down conductors due to the new hardware that'll be installed. And
Mr. Herson, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You referenced in the past 2 slides this short line, and I guess there's been discussion that there's concern that this is a one piece of a longer piece of an old line. So is that correct, that the rest of this line coming out of the substation, the Five Forks substation going the other direction, is that also 100 years old?
It is similar in age. That's a 20-mile segment that runs from the Five Forks substation down towards Baltimore City. The reason that we're proposing to do just this portion right here is because this is the segment that interconnects with the PPL portion of the line and goes to the Five Forks substation. PPL does actually have plans to do rebuild on their side of the line. We learned this week that they've actually filed with the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission for the equivalent of the discretionary waiver here.
Sure, and that's fine for PP&L, and we don't really have anything to do with what happens on the Pennsylvania side. But what happens on the other side of the Five Forks in Maryland? And what are the plans? Is there a plan in the next, say, 2 to 5 years to start working on the 20 lines, the 20 miles that are also 100 years old?
There could be. That could certainly be in the plans. However, in response to some of the comments you've already heard today, it is not our intention to bring those 20 additional miles to you in piecemeal fashion. We would file that as a complete project, 20 miles between the Five Forks substation and whatever the substation is at the terminus.
So why why are we doing these 2 miles separately from the 20 miles? I'm confused as to why the 2 miles are a different project than the 20 miles on the other side of the substation.
Well, you can improve the reliability. In tandem with the PPL work, you can improve the reliability of the transmission system between the Five Forks substation and I believe it's called the Face Rock substation in PPL territory. So in order to maximize the benefits from this work, we're trying to coordinate these projects with PPL on the other side to improve the reliability between those two substations.
Okay, so if PPL does, in fact, do the work on the other side of the state line, then the reliability impact there will be a reliability impact, and therefore, I mean, if they didn't do it, would there be a reliability impact?
My understanding is that we would still have positive impacts on the BGE portion of the system. Certainly that would be enhanced if PPL was able to complete their work on their side of the state line.
And do you know if PP&L's process is a full CPCN type process, or is it a process that might also be expedited?
Well, as I mentioned, they do have a full CPCN process, I believe, in Pennsylvania, but they have actually sought permission from the Pennsylvania PUC for a discretionary waiver similar to what we're asking for here. And that's currently pending before the PA.
It's already been filed?
It has been filed.
Uh-huh.
It was filed on March 15th, is my understanding.
It was filed on March 15th.
Yeah, and I've been told that they do not have any objections from their community members that are impacted by their side of the construction, and that they do not anticipate any environmental concerns with their side.
And do you have any idea what the timeline is for is there a set timeline process for the Pennsylvania PUC to make a determination, or do you have any idea about timelines there?
Unfortunately, I don't. I don't know what their timeline is.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It may be the same, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks from filing. I just don't know. I'm sorry. I can find out, though.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. So going back to number 5 here, the expected outcome here, as I mentioned, is a significant increase in reliability. We're reducing the total number of conductors. We're reducing the opportunity for foreign interference, both by bird nest debris, and balloons. There'll be easier fault finding with a single line as compared to the existing parallel tower lines. And because we would be replacing 100-year-old infrastructure, it's just expected to be much more reliable, given that it's new. In our initial filing, we had included a timeline that began construction in April, I believe. Due to the delays in getting this to hearing, we've pushed that back so that we don't plan on starting construction until July of this year, and it would be approximately 6 months to complete the project. Hopefully this gives the Commission an idea and a sense of what the different structures will look like. On the left-hand side of the slide, you're looking at a rendering of the current parallel line structures. The one on the left would be if you're literally standing on the Maryland-PA line with Maryland to your left and PA to your right, you would see the structures there as you see them in this picture. It's a 100-foot wide right-of-way. That's staying the same. It will remain a 100-foot right-of-way. But as you can see, we'll be effectively moving the new tower line into the middle of the right-of-way, meaning that the towers would actually be farther away from the adjoining landowner's property. The height range there, it is increasing in height. That's one of the reasons why this doesn't qualify for the mandatory waiver provision. The height range goes from 64 feet and 77 feet on the existing structures to 80 feet to 115 feet on the new structures. My understanding from talking to my team is that the minimum delta between the two lines would be a 9-foot increase, and the maximum would be a 50-foot increase. But it's going to vary from tower to tower because the elevation of the ground is different. In terms of conductor size, that's also increasing. You can see the dimensions there. I'm not sure that this is totally to scale, but it's pretty close to what actual size would be. This is the proposed new conductor is the smallest single BGE standard conductor that meets the existing line ratings. That's why we've selected this size line. There would be no change to the shield wires, the optical ground wires on the line. My understanding is that at the height that the conductors will be strung on the towers, that it's basically imperceptible to somebody standing on the ground the size difference between the two lines.
Mr. Herson, I
Yes.
understood there were some I had some questions. There was some very little bit of discussion about clearance. Is this going, the current clearance, is it under some sort of older, because it's an older line? Where are we with respect to clearance between these two lines?
That's correct. My understanding is, and Mr. Chambers can correct me if I say anything out of turn, the existing clearance on the line was based on an old standard that has now been updated. There's a new code in place. So the new tower line, as well as the way the conductors are configured, which is a vertical configuration, would require some additional vertical clearance between the lowest strung conductor and the ground level, which is in part why the towers have to be higher.
So the existing towers that are there don't actually meet the current standard for clearance for newer construction, I guess
my
is sort of
understanding.
the question.
You want to speak to that? Okay, Mr. Chambers wants to address the commission.
Okay.
Yeah, good morning. It's exciting to be here, talk about the project with the group. Yes, the clearances from the ground to the lowest conductor currently don't meet the BGE standards. The increase, is a benefit to the farmers in the area. It kind of increases the distance between the ground that they would farm underneath. So sometimes these wires, while they're not a risk at the moment, they are low. So the other benefit to raising the conductors and increasing the clearances is to the avian interference, where we spoke to that there's a phase and maybe a vulture is generally what the takes are. It's a vulture take. The wing will extend, touch the conductor, and also come in contact with the grounding elements of the circuit. So with these new designs for the poles, you really take away that opportunity for a bird to for a vulture take in most cases.
Right. So if these are not currently meeting your standards, does that, what kind of, doesn't that cause a significant concern for the company and for the safety of public in general?
Defer to Dan, but like I said, these were built over 100 years ago, and the industry and BGE standards change with time. And so when we get an opportunity to rebuild these lines, we rebuild to the best standard possible.
Okay, thank you.
You said that was a BGE standard, or is that also a national?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And when you look at your whole system, you're, I guess, looking at the transmission side. How many of your towers at this point meet your standard? Do you have a general ballpark percentage? Do you have a lot of towers that don't meet your standard, or what?
I'd have to really defer back to the head of the transmission design department to get an accurate number.
Okay, but you don't even have a ballpark at this point.
No,
there's not a company effort to go out and make sure all your towers meet the standard, or is it just a talking point for this particular project?
It's a talking point for this project for sure.
Okay, thanks.
I will say, I don't know if we'll get this question, but some might say, well, why didn't you do this earlier? Why is this so old? This is only being done now. Our answer to that is that obviously we have a big transmission line system. Frankly, the projects that we focused on in general up to this point have been load-related reliability upgrades. So in order to avoid blackouts or rolling brownouts, that sort of thing, that's really been our focus in recent years, to try to upgrade any lines where PJM was indicating to us that we had an issue that we had to address. It's only been recently that we've had the opportunity to turn towards more infrastructure reliability type projects where we can say, okay, how old is this particular segment, and we should probably do something about that. So that in part explains why we're just getting around to this now.
So this project isn't a PJM RTEP project?
It is not,
This
Commissioner
is one of
Richard.
your supplemental type of
I don't even know if
project.
it's technically a supplemental project in terms of how that term is used in PJM vernacular. It is not a directive of PJM to us to do this work. This is a decision that we've elected to do based on the age and the outages that we've had on this particular line. But it is not an RTEP project. It is not a market efficiency project.
Okay, which I think is by definition, PJM a supplemental project.
Okay, yeah, I do not claim to be an expert on PJM, so that may be true. I mentioned earlier the reduction in footprint. So right now, as we said, we have 40 towers out there. Those are basically configured in 20 sets of 2. And right now, for each of those towers, there is a 15-foot by 15-foot foundation footprint. With the monopole structure, you would go down to a 4.5-foot to 7.5-foot diameter circle foundation. So there's significant reduction in the foundation impact of the new line. And that affords the opportunity for new vegetation to grow under the line. That could be native vegetation. It could be vegetation that we manage as part of our integrative vegetation management process, or it could be farmland. Right now, we do have some existing farmland under the line. That's not owned by us. Or we own the line, but we allow farming in the right-of-way. So there may be an opportunity for some of the farmers out there to increase their acreage. In terms of environment and agency oversight, we do not envision, and we have not concluded that there is any wetland impacted by this project. There is one wetland along the line that I'll talk about in a minute, but we have managed to design this project to completely avoid that particular spot. As Mr. Chambers mentioned, the monopole design is expected to minimize avian events going forward. I just mentioned that the overall footprint of the structures is being significantly reduced. When we did have our correspondence with Department of Natural Resources last year, they identified a potential bog turtle habitat, and I believe that was the rare, threatened, or endangered species that Director Tansabell was referring to. Potential habitat, it wasn't confirmed, but what we did is we said, you know what, we're going to assume that the bog turtle is there. And as a result, we're going to do several things. We're going to move a tower location, so one of the towers was relocated to avoid that habitat or potential habitat. We've committed to ensuring that when the lines are strung, that none of the lines will touch any of the wetland area. And we've also agreed to install protective construction fences so that none of the workers out in the right-of-way doing any of the work on the line would be able to access the potential bog turtle habitat. We're also committed to putting temporary matting down that'll be utilized throughout the full construction process to limit any crop damages and to minimize the customer impacts. In terms of the access points, all access would be from state or federal highways. We would not have to traverse any private landowner property, and all construction materials and vehicles would access the site through BGE's existing right-of-way, which we own in fee simple. In terms of permitting, we're almost there with all of our permits. We've already received our construction entrance and access permits from Hartford County. We've received our erosion and sediment control plan permits from the county. We have received our pollution discharge elimination system permit from MDE, and we're waiting on our state highway access permit, which I'm told is imminent, so we expect that any day now.
Mr. Herson, while we stay on the environmental slide, I saw some reference to nesting birds or perhaps raptors in the existing transmission towers. Are there?
Not to our knowledge. We have not observed any raptors or existing nests. And my understanding is
When was the last time you looked, just out of curiosity?
Recently, we've been out there in recent weeks interacting with some of the community members, so we've had opportunities to be out there. My understanding is that that area is not prone to nesting birds or raptor nests. Obviously, I'm not an expert in that area, but in consultation with our team, they said that although there's been avian interference with the existing line, we have not had as big a problem with nesting birds.
If the waiver request was granted, does BG&E have an environmental inspector on site throughout the project?
Yes, we would be able to accommodate that request if we haven't already done that. Mr. Kapler, who's our chief environmental scientist assigned to this project, is in attendance today, so he can confirm.
Mr. Kapler, if you could approach the podium. Is that correct that there would be an environmental officer on site throughout the project's duration?
For our projects, we typically have a a BGE inspector overseeing the contractors, and they've been trained to in sediment erosion control, sensitivity to wildlife, and that such. So we would have a BGE inspector out there who would oversee the contractor as far as any environmental issues or concerns.
Okay, so they're a certified environmental inspector.
Correct.
Okay.
For that, and I guess certified, we have internal training that we require our employees to go through. And for our contractor construction inspectors, it's the sediment erosion training, wetland waterway identification training, and most of these trainings are annually or maybe every 2 or 3 years required to go through refresher training. In addition, they would have the MDE Green Card certification. That's for sediment erosion control. And on this project as well, as we have a stormwater permit from MDE, we will have to also have a third-party contract inspector go out there once a week and the next day after a storm event to inspect all the sediment controls to make sure that they're in place. And I'd like to, I guess, since the avian issues is a concern here and the issue with nests, typically this is the time of the year for raptors to build nests. I've been with BGE for 40 years now, my 40th anniversary last week. And I've been dealing with wildlife issues and bird issues for 30 years. This is the time of the year where, in particular, osprey like to build nests on our equipment. We start to see impacts here in the spring, April, May. Eagle nests typically are built in December, and we've had actually 5 eagle nests on our equipment this year. One up in Harford County on a Grayston 500 kV transmission line. I have no knowledge in the last 30 years of dealing with avian issues of any nests on this particular transmission line up in Harford County, and I have never encountered any nesting issues up there.
Thank you, Mr. Kaplan. Why don't you stay in the orchestra if we need you for more? Okay, thank you. Mr. Herson, unless we have more, we'll probably have more environmental questions.
Okay.
Commissioner Herman.
What about trees, Mr. Herson? How many trees are we cutting down? Are we cutting down any trees, or
Yeah,
just a couple of trees? You know, where are we on the trees?
I think there may have been some miscommunication on that front. In our initial filing, we used the term clearing, I believe. There's not actually going to be any trees felled as part of this project. There may be some tree trimming that goes on to maintain clearances between the new lines and the trees. That is our bad if we left the impression with PPRP or the commission that any trees would be removed as part of this process. That is not the intention.
Okay.
So I wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
So I'm glad you asked that question.
Can I just ask on that, will there be any Forest Conservation Act implications to this project whatsoever? I think that was one of the items that was raised by PPRP.
It was. Not to our knowledge. I will say, Commissioner Richard, that, if that is something that is of concern to the PPRP or the Commission, we are more than happy to put a condition on the granting of this waiver, subject to whatever in that particular area the parties deem important. I don't want to leave the impression that we don't care about that sort of thing or that aspect of the project, but we're not aware of any obligations associated with this project under that act. But
okay, yeah,
and we'll make that offer if that's.
I certainly don't know that from the bench, but it's just what was something that was in the filings. On your point about waivers, how would this come about? Have you talked to PPRP at all about some of these preliminary waivers? Have you memorialized, for instance, the bog turtle issue? You just brought up the Forest Conservation Act, which was, I believe, mentioned in the PPRP. In the process we're in right now, how would these conditions become part of the record?
Well, I think, let me give you a little bit of background about our interaction with PPRP on this. So we filed this on January 11th, and they received a copy the day it was filed.
January 11th.
And, that's almost 3 months ago at this point. We met with them on February 19th. It was a good meeting. It was a couple-hour meeting, I believe. Staff was there as well. And one of the things that I offered to Ms. McLemore and the rest of the attendees was, although we thought this was a good candidate for a discretionary waiver, we were more than happy to listen to what their concerns were and, if necessary, to put certain conditions on the granting of this waiver. And I still believe that the commission could grant the waiver subject to whatever conditions they wanted, and certainly retain oversight of BGE if necessary to ensure that those conditions are met. I know that was a concern of Commissioner O'Donnell on one of the prior discretionary waiver requests, that he was concerned that the commission would somehow lose the ability to direct BGE to do things once the waiver is granted. That's not our intention here. If there's something that the commission wants to impose on us, to grant the waiver, we're more than willing to do that. Although Ms. McLemore appreciated that offer was never accepted. They did not put conditions on this. They just took the position that we do not want to support a discretionary waiver on this particular project. So we did not memorialize anything because they did not accept that offer from us. But as I sit here today, and I'll say it again, if that's what it takes to get the waiver granted, we're more than happy to adhere to any of those conditions.
Ms. McLemore, is that an accurate representation?
That is an accurate representation, and we do appreciate the opportunity to provide conditions on this. However, the concern we have is we don't have the information necessary to determine those conditions because the process is not there. There was no ERD filed. We have not had
What
a
is that,
site.
ERD?
I apologize. An environmental review document explaining thoroughly and in writing all the things in detail of what has been discussed today. Typically, we get that with an application for CPCN, and that gives us an opportunity to review it, do an independent review, and then ask data request and do a site visit and to determine what are the issues that we then we recommend conditions to the commission to put on the CPCN. That was our concern, is there is no process for us to determine what conditions are correct to put on the waiver on this line.
So PPRP does not have a process, absent a CPCN, to produce conditions if we grant for good cause the utilities request?
Chairman, if requested, we can do our best to provide conditions. But, we go off, for this, we can only go off the filing. And I think BGE did offer to be responsive data requests, but the data request is we want an environmental review document. We want our consultants to go on site like we normally do. And since we can't do any of that, we have to go out just off the filing, and we could offer, data request after data request to ask all this type of information that we're getting now, but we just, without going through the full process, we don't have the information we need to know which conditions we need to place on it.
So PPRP has only seen the paper, the application that BGE
Both
has
filings.
filed.
We haven't conducted a site visit that would normally be conducted with our environmental consultants and our project manager.
So nobody from PPRP has been on the ground?
Correct.
Okay.
And may I add one thing, too? Also, when we don't get the information up front, it kind of puts the onus on us to go out and discover what is there instead of being able to have that information before us from the people that have the information, which is the applicant.
Mr. Alexander.
I have some things to say at the conclusion of this, unless you want to hear them now. But
let's wait. I know we're not fully through the presentation.
I was just going to comment on this.
Yes.
The comment is when I hear about we'll agree to conditions and we'll agree to this and agree to that, I'm just hearing that's a CPCN process. That's the point of the process, is that the PPR looks, they get conditions. We all consider, staff and PPRP and OPC, alternatives, looking for, in OPC's particular turf, whether these alternatives would be less expensive. We would also look to see if these alternatives might link better to the other 20 miles that are going to be done sometime or other. And so what I'm hearing is when you get conditions, and we'll agree to conditions, and we'll have an environmental person on site, and this is just a shorthand for a CPCN process, but without the more formal and intensive and productive review. It's just a shorthand for it. And meanwhile, OPC, at least in the process that Mr. Herson stated, would kind of be left out because our focus is not environmental. Our focus is on economic and reliability and alternatives.
Well, I think the utility would agree with you that it is a shorthand or a shortcut. It cuts out some of the red tape, some of the timetable, some of the thoroughness of the review in exchange for getting an expedited project up and running. So I doubt Mr. Harrison would disagree with you on that point.
Can I just ask, Mr. Alexander, you just brought up OPC's primary objective, their responsibility is for the economics, the impact on residents, and on reliability. So from your perspective, wouldn't there be value to customers to expedite this process and save some of the costs of a full CPCN if it's possible that parties could come together, since it is a relatively focused and direct project? And because the customers will get a less expensive project overall, and it'll address these reliability issues that have been pointed out that are critical in this particular segment.
If OPC can't, we would need to retain an expert in BGE's transmission, which we have. One, for example, might be Peter Lanzalotta, who's testified in the past before this commission. We would need a lot of answers in terms of the alternatives. There could be a number of alternatives that could be both less costly and more efficient, and would link better and decrease the cost going down towards Baltimore. But that's not something that OPC can do just like in a day or two or something, because there would be a series of DRs, and then the reliability issues would have to be determined. But that's what we're
not to believe this, but would PPR OPC be doing this? I mean, this is a transmission project. Okay, this ultimately will go in formula rates and is more part of the PJM transmission process. Would you be doing that anyway in a CPCN review, doing this full evaluation of all these various permutations of projects on the transmission scale?
We do. Commissioner, if you allow me, I don't have the authority to say that, because it depends on budget and it depends on People's Counsel, Carmody and Deputy People's Counsel feels to finally approve the support we would need to do this. With that caveat, Your Honor, I do go before FERC on behalf of the OPC in terms of whenever the ROE changes, a Section 205 is filed. We do participate. I have personally participated in those proceedings, and we have often gone to settlements, and settlements have often resulted in lower ROEs than requested by the Commission. The siting aspect is not something that FERC considers. Siting is almost always, there's a fight about one provision, but it's reserved to the states.
Yeah.
And so are we involved in CPCNs? Yes, we are involved in many of the CPCNs for transmission, and we have often filed comments and recommendations that are separate from the conditions that PPRP may impose. And I really think with this project actually being a 22-mile project in essence, it's even more important to discuss alternatives, because there possibly are alternatives that are perhaps more reliable and less expensive, but that takes an expert review, and right now we don't. The process is not here to do that and do DRs. But I'd like to add one thing to your question, which is that this project won't start till July anyway. Right now, it's the beginning of April. A CPCN process does not need to be 6-9 months a year, It depends on the, for PPRP, what's on the table for their experts. We could go, if we're going to have an expert, we could go immediately. Let me also say that if we don't have an expert, I can do DRs, that I've done enough of these to focus on what I'm looking for and get assurance that this is indeed the best project with the best, lowest cost and highest benefit of reliability. I hope if I didn't answer your question, could you tell me?
No, I agree. I mean, for transmission projects, the CPCN process really is the only opportunity that the state has to do the type of economic analysis you're talking about. But on the other hand, when we're talking about a 1.8 mile, improvement project, essentially, for cause, I mean, they've identified some real failures that are taking place, causing reliability issues. If we're going to do this full transmission analysis, I mean, I don't know if that would be necessarily something that would be done in a timely manner and in a cost-effective. That's my concern.
I understand your question and concern. I'd only say is that CPCN's the timing of it is in part with deference to PPRP, but also they're often sent to the PULJs. The PULJ can set a schedule, usually asking the parties and with certain guidance into what is looking for. But I still would say that in the process of the CPCN, we would be seeking not just this, but information about the entirety of the line, and we would be looking at certain aspects of that in a technical manner to make sure that this fits in with the bigger picture. And right now, before you, I just mentioned it. It is not mentioned.
No, Mr. Alexander, I think you've made that point clear.
Sorry, I'm out.
Thank you. Mr. Herson, unless you'd like to respond to any of that, and we might get back to that.
A quick response. I don't want to quarrel with OPC or PPRP. I don't think there's any value in that today for the Commission. The only thing I'd like to say is that both of these agencies have had this application since January 11th. I have received 0 data requests from OPC or PPRP in that entire span. I did get 25 data requests from staff. Those were helpful. We answered those. They've attached some of those to their comments. But there was more than ample opportunity to ask us for more information. And we did provide site plans to PPRP. We emailed them to the project manager right after our February 19th meeting. So they have had some information, and they have had an opportunity to ask us additional questions. I'll leave it at there and continue on with the slideshow. I think these last couple slides may be the most important to the decision before you today because they really go to the core of what we've done in lieu of the CPCN process and why we believe this is a good candidate for a waiver. On this particular project, we have had extensive agency outreach and feedback with many of the same agencies that PPRP would consult with as part of the CPCN process. As I've mentioned a couple times, we've already provided the filing to staff, PPRP and OPC in January. We've responded to PSC staff data requests. We've met with staff and PPRP. This is important. We've engaged Department of Natural Resources, MDE, the Maryland Historical Trust, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Maryland Aviation Administration, State Highway Administration, and Harford County's Department of Public Works and Soil Conservation District. We have received no issues or objections from any of those state agencies. MDE issued a stormwater discharge permit for the project, which we have to adhere to, and they will have oversight on the project. FAA said there's no impact and therefore no further notice is required. We contacted the Maryland Aviation Administration. They said there is no impact with this particular project. Maryland Historical Trust issued a determination that there's no cultural or historic resources impacted by this project. DNR Wildlife and Heritage Service, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, actually issued us a letter finding no impact except for the potential bog turtle habitat, which I had mentioned earlier we addressed. And we received all of our permits and will continue to be subject to the oversight of the Harford County Department of Public Works on the permits that they issue. In terms of community and elected officials outreach, which I know is another important consideration for the Commission, we've done extensive community outreach on this project. There have been 3 outreach letters sent to local community members. One was a letter detailing the actual planned construction work, where we told them this is what's going to be done. One was a letter at an earlier date stating that we were going to be conducting some studies in the right-of-way, and we had another letter similar to that mentioning that we were going to be conducting geotechnical studies. We didn't just send these letters to the landowners in immediate proximity to the line. We actually looked out and said, okay, who's actually living within the view shed of this line? We provided them, all of them, these 3 letters. Then we arranged to have a presentation provided at a community association meeting. And my understanding is in Hartford County, county executives and the county council actually assign community boards for particular areas of the county. So this was the officially sanctioned community association board that we presented to.
And we have a letter from them, is that right?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
And these were filed in prior weeks, but I know sometimes things get lost in the filing room, so I provided hard copies here. So before you are 2 letters. One is a letter of support from the Whiteford, Cardiff, Pilesville Street Community Advisory Board, supporting the waiver request. This was the organization that we presented to. This was a very well-attended event. If you have questions about it, Ms. Rhodes Reed organized and coordinated that event. She attended the event. We got lots of good questions. We were able to answer all of those questions. We have no objection from the community to this project. They expect the project to take place this summer. They're looking forward to the project. They all know about the project. And I would venture to say, if you were to have a full CPCN review and you did hold a public hearing in that vicinity, I would venture to say that the meeting that we had back in March probably would be better attended than that meeting. Because
Tell us more about this event in March.
Okay, I'm going to invite Ms. Rhodes Reed up to the microphone. She really did all the legwork on this.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. So what we did in March, I actually reached out to the president of the Community Advisory Board asking if we could attend and present this project to the community. They granted us that opportunity. We presented in March. There were some questions from the stakeholders in the area that attended. Mainly, the questions centered around the reliability. As you saw on the slide earlier, there have been approximately 7 major outages over the last 10 years. So when we told them about this project, they were obviously in support. Another question that came up is, would we have to, would we work outside of our right-of-way? And we confirmed that, no, we will not be working outside of BGE's right-of-way. But majority of the questions centered around the reliability of the existing towers that are there now.
I'm surprised by that. I thought the majority of questions would focus on the structures themselves.
But there were some questions about the structures, the difference in the structures. Todd Chambers also attended that event. So
okay. And where was this event held?
It was held in Dublin, Maryland.
In a school or?
No, it was actually at the library.
Okay. And how many residents attend?
I would say approximately about 15 stakeholders.
And none of these residents or stakeholders expressed any concern or opposition?
No opposition was voiced at that meeting.
Was this the only event that was held?
That was the only event held for the community. I did conduct a separate meeting with Councilman Schrodes and also County Executive Glassman.
And I see we have a letter that was filed by Councilmember Schrodes. He's in strong support of the project. Can you represent the position of the county executive?
Yes, he was in agreement of the need of the project because of the reliability issues. But outside of that, he didn't have any opposition. He did want to know about the new structures that will be replacing the lattice towers that's currently there.
Okay. Thank you, Ms.
Yeah, and okay, yeah, the meeting was for Councilman Schrodes, but in attendance there were also Councilman Wagner and Councilman Tony G. Giordani.
While you're up at the stand, can I just ask a couple questions about the letter you sent out?
Yes.
I'm looking at it's in one of the I think it's it's a packet of materials that came with. I think your I'm not sure what it came with. It's here. On the March 2019, it's a dear customer letter. How many of those letters were sent out? Was that for the whole county, or did you target again just this area around? I think it was referred to as the view shed of the power line.
It was, I believe, approximately 42 letters that were sent out to the neighboring customers that's actually in the view shed of the project.
Okay. So you limited to just that area. Did you get any responses? You did provide an email address. Did anyone respond or provide comments as a result of that letter?
As a result of that letter, Todd Chambers, if you want to come up, we did have one customer that had some questionings about the placement of the new pole. But outside of that, no, we did not receive any.
And before you answer that, just the text of the letter. Did you work with any of state agencies and how you communicated? And the reason I ask is, I mean, it talks about it. There's going to be an upgrade to the existing overhead transmission line, and it talks about towers being removed, 40 going to 12,
Right.
But it doesn't ever really talk about that they're going to be taller towers. There's really nothing in the letter that talks about a request for a waiver. So I guess my question is, do you think it was a complete letter? And did you get any council input on that letter, or was it any kind of input from a state agency such as PPRP and what a letter should look like? For instance, input from OPC on what the letter should look like. I'm just trying to gauge whether this is sufficient as a communique, or
Well, actually, before we send any external letters out, we do get approval through our internal legal and communications team. But far as external input, no, we did not have external input for the letter.
Okay. And yeah, I'd be interested to know any kind of feedback. You said you got
It was
one of the 42 that received the letter provided feedback.
Yeah, yes, and it's right there at the Maryland PA line. We met with the concerned customer last Friday, just to discuss, what the concerns were, and we're going to meet with them next Friday to kind of discuss some screening options for the customer.
Oh, okay. So it could be potentially another condition that we
Right.
want to, at least consider. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to those remarks is we did get some input from, I think it was staff at the February meeting, or it might have been Ms. McElroy, I can't remember, but somebody in attendance noted that we needed a more specific letter to go out to customers, because at that point we had only sent out the studies letters. So we took that and we went back and said, okay, we need to make another communication, which is what we did here. So although I did not run the text of the letter by them, they did have some input into the fact that we've sent out a more detailed correspondence. And as I have here on the slide, it's our intention to send another letter prior to construction activities, and if necessary, hold another community meeting as well.
Okay. And I would just note, it looks like in the studies letter, it never mentions why you're doing the studies, why the company's doing the studies. Just to be aware that BGE will be on site, but it doesn't say because we're considering an upgrade, I guess the way you put it, to the transmission line. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I think there's a reason for that, though. We don't, at those early stages, and that was over a year ago, or about a year ago at this point, we weren't exactly committed to the project yet. We weren't sure exactly how we were going to do it, so we don't want to unnecessarily alarm customers about a project and then come back later and say, oh, well, never mind. We're not going to do it.
Fair enough.
Something
Thank you.
like that. So I don't know all the details of that, but I know that that's one of the considerations in not going as detailed as we did in the March letter of this year.
Mr. Chairman, just one clarification. OPC was not invited to the meeting between BGE PPRP and staff. OPC was never invited to participate in any of these meetings, whether it's with council, especially though with the public. Those meetings were not, as far as I know, recorded as the evening public comments hearings are in a CPCN. We have a court reporter there. OPC attends every one. We answer questions also because people don't always get the full information, and we often are asked questions afterwards. And so I just want to clarify that we were excluded from this entire process, and we would not have been excluded in at least some of it if this was a full CPCN. Thank you.
Noted on the record. And to be clear, that meeting I don't expect was recorded by video or a court reporter?
No, it wasn't.
Thank you.
I believe OPC was invited to the February meeting. I'll have to double check that.
Okay, well, we won't dispute that now, but
Anyway, I'll move on.
Okay.
Last slide here. So really the ultimate question before the commission, is there good cause to grant the waiver that we're requesting? In our mind, yes, there is. The waiver would allow for faster completion of the reliability upgrades. The reality is that the CPCN process right now, given PPRP's workload, which is pretty extensive, is anywhere from 18 to 24 months to get a final licensing conditions and recommendations. If we are able to avoid that process and get these reliability improvements on the system quicker, I think that's a good thing for customers. The waiver would reduce costs for customers, and it would free up valuable agency resources. You avoid having to do extensive engagement with and retention of, frankly, very expensive consultants to put together an environmental review document, which is several $100,000, that I would argue is not going to result in anything different than what we've presented to you today.
If I could have Director Tansable respond to both those first two bullets. Do you expect that your portion of the CPCN process would take between 18 and 24 months for this line?
Yeah, I don't think that's accurate. I think Sandra can help on, or Ms. Mathemore can help on that. But I think, the Ringgold Catoctin upgrade we just did, which was 20 some miles, was I think 14 months.
I think it was 14 months, yes.
Thank you. Did you have something else?
Yes. In addition, because of all the work that BG&E has already done on this, in some instances, particularly with smaller CPCNs, we have been able to do CPNs in a more expeditious fashion, and I don't see how that might not be the case in this instance, particularly since they've already done quite a bit of work.
Okay, thank you.
So what would, in this expedited fashion, how many months would that be, do you think?
Well, Commissioner, I think the issue is, that's from when they file. Obviously, if they're going to have to do an ERD, that's going to take time. But,
Right.
from when we get it, we can, turn around 12, 14 months. If it's complete, and it is as expected, as BGE is expected. But again, we just don't know since we haven't seen that work and we haven't been on site.
When you say 12 to 14 months, do you mean 12 to 14 months for the time for you to
From filing
respond,
to
or until the CPCN is granted?
filing to order for Ringgold to Catoctin was 14 months.
For Ringgold to Catoctin, it was 14 months. However, if we receive all the information we need, there are instances where we can do things faster. It all depends on the information that we are provided and when we are provided it, and also if there are any issues. Based on what Mr. Herson said today, they have done a lot of the work, and they also have no issues. If those two things are true, it should not take as long.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, we're already subject to extensive project permitting on this particular project and oversight by both state and county officials. In terms of outreach, there's strong community and elected official support. This is a very rural area. There's not a ton of impacted customers. We believe that we have touched all of the impacted customers for this particular line.
When you say touched, have you knocked on doors or just the letters that went out?
The letters, the community meetings. I don't believe we've done canvassing door to door.
How did they find out about the community meetings? I didn't see any correspondence with respect to meetings. It looks like Ms. Rhodes has a response.
So the community advisory boards, they have set meetings on a monthly basis. So it was a pre-scheduled meeting, and we asked to be on their agenda. So the neighboring stakeholders know when the meetings are held.
I looked at the map, the satellite map, and did the Google street tour down Whiteford Road. So all those residents from Rock Road to Whiteford have all been put on notice. They've all received letters, you're saying?
To my knowledge, yes.
They have. I actually have a list somewhere in my
So
file.
there's 42,
Yes.
that's the universe that we're talking about, 42.
That's correct.
How many houses you count?
That's about, I estimated 50.
So, Director Tansable, with respect to the BGE suggestion that they're already subject to extensive permitting and oversight by other agencies, you said that you worked with respect to this particular project, you already spoke to 6 other agencies? Did I hear that right, or is that what you would normally do?
That's our normal coordination. We have not done the same extensive coordination. We have, touched other agencies that this is happening again. We're trying to figure out this process to be able to do, an assessment based on filings, still come up with a state position, and get it to the commission because we want to be able to. But so our coordination is much less than it would be. But that's normal that that coordination from the company outside the CPCN process, because there's a lot that the other agencies do that is outside the process, even when you go through the CPCN. So it's pretty common.
Right. So, I guess my question is, do you have, for example, customary CPCN conditions that you would impose on an applicant for a transmission line for this kind of rebuild that would not be attached to the company if they didn't get a CPCN? Do you have any examples of existing types of conditions that you might want to impose and that you have imposed and companies probably have agreed upon that wouldn't be on the company in this case?
Commissioner Herman, we can already identify some that we would probably want. Again, there's a lot that's been done in research on the best practices for operation and maintenance that we've placed on lines. And again, since there's no CPCN on this line, there's none of that. Even old conditions aren't even applicable. Mm-hmm. RTE areas we have,
What's an RTE area?
Rare, threatened, endangered species area. Since there was some habitat identified, forest conservation. Those are areas that we would explore. But again, we just don't have. We don't know the specifics of what we would ask for. Mm-hmm. But obviously, operation and maintenance. There's some language we would want. I guess our concern again is that is this creation, the potential for an alternative process that we're going to be expected to start following, and our consultants, we're going to have to start trying to figure out how to work through it, and that's one of our main concerns.
Okay, thank you very much.
But just to be clear, Mr. Director, based on Commissioner Herman's question, there are stock conditions that PPRP would likely attach to a transmission line of this sort.
There are operation and maintenance conditions for a right-of-way that have not
generic
that have not been placed anywhere on this right-of-way that most likely would. I hesitate to say generic because we look at each one for a specific project, but in general O&M conditions in that category that would be used.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So, Mr. Herson, this raises a question. For example, I'm just going to use a hypothetical. Let's say there's goldenrod growing in the right of way, and PPRP traditionally, in an effort to preserve goldenrod, I think there's a particular insect or species that likes goldenrod. I can't recall what it was, but let's say hypothetically that there's goldenrod, and BGE would be under no obligation to try to preserve the goldenrod because you have no existing conditions, and PPRP hasn't proposed any. And as a hypothetical, wouldn't that, potentially have an impact, on the environment that we could avoid if we went through the CPCN process?
You might be able to avoid that, but we've already engaged DNR. We've had interactions with them last year. That wasn't identified as an issue on this particular
Well, I get
stretch.
that, but a hypothetical, some other, somewhat of a, something else might be identified. I mean, this line has absolutely no conditions
Well,
attached
I
to it,
want to
isn't
push
that right?
back on that statement from PPRP. It's true it hasn't gone through the modern-day CPCN process, but prior to the enactment of the CPCN laws in the early 1970s, all of this was subject to local zoning requirements and ordinances and environmental controls. So I think it's an inaccurate statement to say that none of these segments have conditions on them. I don't know what the particular conditions are on this 1.8-mile stretch, but these weren't just built haphazardly, not subject to some sort of oversight.
Of course not, but wouldn't you agree, Mr. Herson, that environmental laws have changed somewhat substantially since the
Early 70s.
since the early 70s?
I would agree with that statement.
If it's 100 years old, wouldn't it have been earlier than that?
I don't know when the last zoning issue was addressed on this particular line. I would agree with your statement that the laws have changed, which is exactly why we engaged DNR last year on this project and said, hey, we're planning on doing this. What are some of the issues you can identify on this line? They took a look at it. They identified the potential bog turtle habitat. We made adjustments accordingly. So I don't want to leave the commission or stakeholders with the impression that we did not engage the appropriate officials.
Right.
We did.
So, Director, do you have something to say?
Sure. I'd like to just say that some of our conditions, we have seen we got to look at site plans. We haven't been able to do a thorough review that we would like to do, but 8 access points and 13 acres of disturbance. We would most likely on a CPCN place a lot of conditions on their their access points, how they're going to specifically do their matting. There's a lot of more specific information we would want to know in place, for that much level of disturbance and that many access areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you
Which
very
I
much.
would have loved to have received a data request about, but we didn't.
Well, I understand that, Mr. Herson, and I understand that you did, the company did a lot of outreach, and I don't think, for my part, I'm not being critical of the company with respect to its outreach. I think they've done a great deal of work. My concern is what we're hearing right here, right now, today, is a mini CPCN without all the information, and that is, that's a. I'm not saying it can't be overcome, but that's a question I have here, and is that the appropriate interpretation of good cause? So I have to think about that for myself, and I just wanted you to be not being critical. The company has done a great deal of outreach, and I think all of the parties appreciate that outreach, and they have said that. So
Okay, thank you. Two
I'll let
closing
you
points,
conclude.
Mr. Chairman, and then we can answer any more questions. PSC staff made the argument that somehow if you grant this, you'd be setting a precedent. We don't agree with that. I do think it's a little unusual the positions they've come down on this, given the 2 prior discretionary waivers that were granted to BGE were projects that were much more invasive, longer lengths, greater costs, more impact to communities than this particular project. But if they are going to object to it, our response to that is the commission can deal with these projects on a fact-by-fact basis as they get them. We don't expect or anticipate that just because they were approved in the past, they're going to be approved now. So I just want to clear that up, that I don't believe there would be some sort of precedent being set by granting the waiver here. And then with respect to the directors, I guess it's a policy position that they're saying, well, if it hasn't been through a CPCN before, then it should not be a candidate for a waiver. That's a very troubling position for us in the transmission business. We have over 1,200 miles of overhead transmission line. We're an old company. I suspect there's quite a number of segments that have not gone through the modern day CPCN process. They are subject to the conditions, the zoning conditions I mentioned before. If going forward, we're going to have to bring every segment through a full CPCN process, I think that's going to have a significant impact on system reliability over the long term. So nowhere in COMAR, nowhere in the PUA does it state the statement that the director has made here, I would urge the commission to resist writing that into the law through their order today. And we're available for further questions.
So, Mr. Herson, on your last bullet on the last page,
Yes.
we know that this is a portion of a longer line. It's 2 miles of a 20-mile line. So, are we not setting ourselves up for potential precedent if we issue a waiver now? I mean, is there a possibility in the future that there's at least one more request for a waiver of the CPCN, or maybe even several on the same line?
Well, Commissioner Linton, as I represented before, it is not our intention to bring, if we bring at all, the remaining 20 miles in a piecemeal fashion. So you're not going to see from us, 4 miles here, 2 miles there. The reason this was 1.8 miles was because it went from the state line to that substation. That was a definite, delineated segment that we could put forward in this waiver proceeding. We have not made a decision on the remaining 20 lines yet, whether that would be brought as a full CPCN or whether we would seek a discretionary waiver. We haven't made that determination yet. So although I can't state for certain that we would not try to bring it as a discretionary waiver, certainly the commission, if it was faced with that application from us, we would expect full scrutiny of that full 20-mile line project, and not simply, well, we approved it for the Five Forks to the state line, so I guess we got to approve it here. That's not our expectation.
Okay, so we should look at this then as an effort to kind of, and I'll use the word create a modified version of a CPCN process. I mean, the company, as has already been mentioned, has done took a lot of steps along the way in order to demonstrate that there's a justification for good cause. So assuming that there's a granting of a waiver, it almost, I'll say, looks like there's an acceptance of those steps as suggesting that this was good cause enough to allow a waiver to go forward. So we're not setting ourselves up. Is it the company's understanding, at least, that we're not setting ourselves or stating that this is that you've done enough this time, and anytime you do that again, it's still enough?
You are correct. Yeah, that's not our expectation or understanding. Unfortunately, as the commissioners know, it just says good cause. There really isn't any more details provided. So we're sort of left with that ambiguity. So as a company, we said, all right, well, what do we have to do here to convince the commission that the steps that we have taken make this a good candidate for a good cause waiver? That's going to be different for every project. Certainly some of the stuff that we did for the Trade Point Atlantic waiver, maybe we wouldn't do here, and vice versa. So no, the answer to your question is we would not, if you granted this waiver, we are not somehow holding the commission to a set of standards that, well, you approved that one earlier because we did X, Y, and Z, so since we've done that for this segment, you're expected to grant us a waiver. That is not how our approach will be.
Okay. All right. I had a separate question, if it's all right, regarding the letter that went out to the consumers. You noted earlier that it went to the consumers that were in the overall view area of the project. By project, did you mean the existing lines, or the lines after they've been raised and upgraded?
The lines afterwards. Whoever would potentially see the heightened weather.
After it's been upgraded. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just pick up this line of question? I think Commissioner Herman and Linton expressed a kind of a concern I have, and that is that we are looking at kind of a new alternative process here, and it does fit very well with the good cause authority we have. But what I'm hearing from the state parties, particularly PPRP, I mean, this is kind of a surprise, maybe is a way to put it to them. They're trying to catch up, and figure out how exactly they're going to look at this good cause, and why I think that the company has been very innovative in how they've tried to look at achieving some of the same elements of a CPCN in this alternative process. I'm hearing from OPC and from PPRP in particular that there may be some elements they'd like to look at a little more. Given that, I mean, what we're hearing today, I mean, do you see there might be some value in just a little more time with the parties to figure out, Is everyone comfortable with this alternative process? Should there be maybe more a collaboration in how, in this alternative process, the good cause process, you might communicate with the I guess impacted parties, have some collaboration in the letter, the way it's written, maybe have an opportunity to talk about what some of the conditions are. I mean, would that be fruitful at all, to just a little more time? Because again, what I'm hearing is that it's, I think, a worthwhile project to consider under good cause, but I'm just concerned that state parties in particular haven't caught up with BGE in this idea of a new process.
I think I understand the question and the point you're trying to make, Commissioner Richard. I would say that we are always willing and able to meet with any of the parties that want to meet with us, take suggestions, take recommendations, take their input on these processes. For this particular project, I don't know that that would need to take place in order for the Commission to feel comfortable granting a waiver here, because of the point I made earlier that for this particular project, I don't know that you're going to have a different outcome at the end of the CPCN process than you would if you granted the waiver today. That being said, if you said, all right, we're going to grant this waiver for this project, but we're directing the company on these future discretionary waivers to meet with OPC and PPRP to develop some sort of process they're comfortable with, we would certainly be amenable to that. But I don't know that it has to hold up approval of this particular 1.8 mile line segment.
Right, and I think that's what I was suggesting in my question, perhaps just a little more time, not maybe, throw out the idea of a good cause, but perhaps, given that the state parties and PPRP, they are the representatives from the state. They are the expert witnesses that we rely on for this information. And just speaking as one commissioner, I'm a little hesitant to want to just discard or undercut the role of in any way of PPRP. So is that it's something, do you think that there might be an opportunity to try to see if you can, with the state, come up with a good cause argument that the other parties could participate in? And I would note that you mentioned the Pennsylvania. It's my understanding, just from a little research this morning, working with our staff, that their alternative process is conditioned on that there be fairly unanimous across-the-board support for that type of a waiver. So I feel like right now we're not quite there yet. We don't have some of the most important parties in support of this good cause waiver, and that is the state. So anyway, just any comment you might have on that.
I don't know that my earlier response changes at all.
Okay.
Again, we're willing to meet with whoever. Again, I don't know for this particular project if it would make a difference, but if that's the difference between getting the waiver and not, then we'd certainly be amenable to that. But again, I don't know that for this. I'll tell you, this is a short line. I know the other parties are calling this a big project. This, in the transmission line world, this is a relatively compact project. We feel like we've done everything we need to do to show the Commission that this is a good cause candidate for the waiver. But
and again, I agree. But
I don't know what else.
What you haven't done is convinced, I think.
I have not convinced my colleagues here. It is not without effort.
Yeah.
Great effort on my part. I'm sorry I wasn't able to do that.
Okay.
But I don't really, as I sit here today, know what else I could do to get them comfortable, absent going through the full process, which I don't think is necessary here. Fair enough. Anyway, I'll stop.
Again, just one quick comment. Say that OPC does retain an expert, and say that we do believe there's an alternative and BGE doesn't want to do that alternative. What's the enforcement? If we're not in a CPCN process, who would decide the issue? We're back to, if we're outside of the CPCN process, what?
Sorry, Mr. Alexander, you lost me there. You're stating that if there was some type of informal condition that the utility does not honor, how to enforce that?
If I may take this, there is no requirement that the applicant or the utility even work with the state. They have agreed to, I understand that, but there is no set alternative process here. And so therefore, everything they do is what they
Feel like
want to do. And I think that might be what Mr. Alexander is saying. And that is a concern for us. We do look at each of these waiver requests on their own. I understand David did say that, Mr. Tanswell did say that, this is a 100-year-old line. It doesn't have CPCN conditions, therefore it is of a concern. That is one concern and in the good cause, when we look at if there's a good cause, but it's not the only one. And the fact that there is not a set alternative process is a concern to us.
Right, we've heard a lot about this alternative process today. Perhaps we've coined that term. I like to see it as either a very thorough, robust CPCN process or it's this discretionary waiver. Perhaps there is a middle road, as we've discussed. Do the parties have any more final statements? Do the commissioners have any questions of the parties before us? Why don't I suggest that we take a brief recess and return at 12:05. Thank you. We are back on the record. Sorry for the delay. This is a difficult case. There are some cases where you try to balance the equities and split the proverbial baby, and other cases where you just have to go in one direction or the other. I think BG&E made a very compelling case through its outreach, the need for the project, and the situations currently on the ground. However, it's the responsibility of the state, particularly the three state agencies here, to protect the natural physical environment, along with consultation with other agencies. That said, Public Utilities Act, Section 7-207 does provide for a good cause waiver. I think BG&E is pretty close in respect to getting that waiver from my perspective. However, PPRP has raised a couple of concerns today, along with OPC and Staff Counsel in its buck sheet. That what I would propose, and let me be clear that I don't want to create a new process. Right now we have the process as enumerated in great detail in 7207 with respect to what needs to happen in a full-blown, thorough CPCN process that could take anywhere from a year to possibly 2 years. The situation here is that we have less than 2 miles of line. We have a project that needs to be built. Towers will be coming down, and only 12 towers will be replaced with concrete pedestals of about 7 or 8 feet. No doubt there will be some environmental disturbance, but from everything I've seen from the filing, that the disturbance would not be substantial. However, I'm not an expert in environment, natural sciences, biology, aquifers, and everything that the good staff at DNR specializes in. I would therefore propose that we defer this matter for a short period to allow the parties at the table to examine the project more fully and provide any conditions. I hesitate to say generic conditions, but at the end of the day, they may be generic conditions that BG&E would consider, not necessarily agree to adopt, but seriously consider and have these discussions with the parties before the Commission renders judgment on BG&E's request. I would suggest that the parties use the next couple of weeks wisely, and then the Commission will return and make a final determination on BG&E's waiver. I recognize that, number one, there's a need for the project. Number two, it should happen relatively quickly. And while the CPCN process is important, there's obviously a time delay associated with that. But let me stress again, because I am concerned with the possible precedent that we're setting, that we're creating a third path. CPCN, granting a good cause waiver, and then creating some additional third process. We are not doing that. What we're doing is allowing a little more time for the parties at the table to share any concerns or conditions with BG&E, and the Commission will then render judgment on the request at a later date. Other commissioners, and Mr. Alexander will get you in a second. Commissioner Richard.
Yeah, I definitely would support that approach to defer. I think you've put it all very well. I mean, the Commission has been given the good cause authority in the Public Utility Act, and I think we need to take some actions to explain, how we arrive at that good cause, and I think this exercise does that. I believe I would like very much to get to the point. I hope we can get to the point where we can provide the company with the waiver. I think they've made a good argument. However, I would want to do nothing to undercut or to short-circuit the power plant research program. They are the expert witness for the state. They represent the state, and so I will always give very heavy weight to anything that they suggest. Also, I think the other parties, OPC and staff, have made important points. So I'm also hopeful that in this period of time that the parties can come together, and I hope that come up to some agreement so that we can. I'd like to think that if possible I can contribute to cutting red tape and helping things move along a little more expeditiously, make Maryland a good place to do business. So I hope we can arrive at that point, and I think this particular project merits a good cause consideration.
I would agree with the suggested motion. I commend the parties for the work they've done thus far, and I'm looking forward to seeing what additional conditions, if any, the parties would like to recommend to BGE, and I'll look forward to seeing that very soon.
I agree with Commissioner Linton. I'll concur with the recommendation of the chairman, and look forward to seeing additional information on good cause in the next time this comes before us.
Mr. Herson, I sensed some frustration earlier today from your position. I recognize that BG&E has worked with DNR since probably last summer on this. What I would suggest, looking at the calendar, is that we work for a few more weeks through May 15th, when you'll be back before the commission. That will provide for sufficient time for OPC, Staff Council, and PPRP to provide any conditions for the utilities consideration. We'll review those conditions as well along with you in the filing, and we'll put this matter to bed on May 15th. Mr. Alexander.
I would respectfully ask that we get 2 more weeks past May 15th, and for this reason. We are, and also in line with that, I would ask that the commission impose a 5-day response time to data requests, because if it's 10 business days, we would only get to ask maybe one set. The reason why I'm saying 2 more weeks is we have to, if we're going to retain an expert, and again, I have to check with my bosses, but if we do, he is going to have to review all of the documents so far that have been filed. He is then going to have to propound DRs. We have to review the DRs, probably do a second set, especially for the alternative, if there is an alternative, and we're going to have to do that. And even with a 5-day DR, May 15th, as we're in April 3, is a little tight considering the DR process. So I want to respect the decision of the commission, and I think you'd get a better, we will fully cooperate. We're going to expedite this. If we do get an expert, they will know that we have to expedite all of it, but I would ask of your patience and grace if we could get an extra week or 2, and I certainly tell you that we will work expeditiously if we do retain an expert to come up with good questions, review those questions. Whatever concerns we have, we will discuss with all the parties, including BGE, and try to, in very good faith, resolve them informally so that when we come before you, if we do have some issues, they will have greatly narrowed. And thank you.
Mr. Herson, what is your position on the request? That would bring us from May 15th to May 29th.
One moment, Your Honor. Mr. Chairman, I was just consulting with Mr. Chambers. The concern we have is that if we don't actually reach some sort of agreement until effectively the 1st of June, the next day, that with the July start time, he's going to have a difficult time getting the appropriate construction vendors and contractors set up if we're going to maintain the schedule that we proposed to the Commission I'm not against the concept of having additional time for appropriate questions to be asked. Discussion about alternatives analysis and stuff concerns me very much. Again, OPC has had this since January. We've delayed this hearing twice. I know that...
and Mr. Hurson, I would tend to agree. Mr. Alexander, I don't know if it would be appropriate in this case to look outside of this project. I believe the utility has committed that if they're going to look at the line south of Five Forks to Baltimore City, that would be a different request entirely. I recognize that you want to take Office of People's Counsel, they want to take a holistic view. And if an OPC consultant were to look at that, you would probably need more than 2 weeks. Just my suggestion.
The other thing, Your Honor, is, and it may not affect your decision here, but I think it's I don't think it's fair that has been repeated a number of times by BGE that why didn't we do this a year or two ago? If BGE had filed for a CPCN 2 years ago when they had planned this already, the CPCN would be done, the process. And so I don't think it's fair to say that in some equitable way that we were sitting on our hands when in fact this whole process could have been over and done with 6 months ago.
Does PPRP have a position on timing and your resources?
More time is always good, right? But we're trying to figure out specifically how much we could use.
Chairman, I think, again, the issue of trying to coordinate conditions with other agencies that we may propose. I'd have to come up with a timeline. I don't know if I can do that right now without talking to our consultants and staff and other agencies to see what if that's doable.
And are we assuming that there would be a 5-day turnaround or a 10-day turnaround on the DRs too? That might be relevant as well.
Because of the compressed time schedule, BG&E should use all best efforts to respond within 5 days. The whole point of this is to expedite the process. I recognize that PPRP, the fact that I received the letter at 10 o'clock last night, is short on resources and may need to coordinate with the 7 other agencies. So I will grant OPC's request for 2 additional weeks. We'll come back then on May the 29th. No additional extensions, so I'd like not to see any requests for additional time. We will be meeting back at the administrative meeting on May 29th. Do the parties have any other questions regarding timing or process?
One additional question. Are you looking for another filing from us in terms of the results of the discourse between these agencies, or are we just going to discuss this at the hearing?
That is a great question. The Commission should be aware of the conditions that the parties seek to impose on BG&E, so they should provide the Commission with a filing in advance. I believe our rule requires those filings to be submitted by noon Monday, the day before, 2 days before the meeting.
Okay.
BG&E need not make a filing. Unless you feel the need to, we'll address that from the bench on the 29th.
I anticipate what you would like to see is an agreement with the conditions there, of course, and that's what we would hope to get you, but if not, we will provide you with the
That would be ideal if the parties can reach some settlement agreement with the utility between now and then.
Chairman, I'm sure we can have some, if you're looking for some sort of at least a partial set that's agreed upon and a set that's not, I'm sure we can come to at least some agreement on a lot of...
I suspect you would be able to do that, and if you could narrow the field when you file your comments on or before the 27th, Monday the 27th, that could help expedite what the scope of what the Commission will be reviewing on that day.
It would be Tuesday the 28th because Monday the 27th is Labor Day, or is Memorial Day, I believe.
Okay, so why don't we move it forward then, if you could file your comments on Friday, the 24th. Yes?
Sure. Just like to offer that BG and our consultant would be more than happy to meet with DNR out at the, or PPRP out at the site and walk the 1.8 mile transmission line so that they can get an on-ground look at it to see just that there really aren't any resources out there that are going to be impacted other than grass and cornfield.
That I think is a good idea, and if PPRP, OPC, and Staff Council have representatives to walk the line and conduct a site visit, maybe as early next week, that would hopefully inform some of the determination. Parties have any additional questions or clarification, so we'll have outstanding conditions and or partial settlement or full settlement filed on or before May 24th. And this matter will be heard at the administrative meeting on May the 29th. Seeing no additional matters before this agency today, and before I adjourn the hearing, I would just encourage the parties here to use this time at the table to meet. So this matter is deferred to the 29th of May. This meeting is adjourned.